The millionaire's daughter is near death, when the housekeeper walks in and notices something unusual.
Hello everyone, enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
Clara Morgan stepped into the grand living room of the Morgan mansion, feeling the unmistakable chill in the air. "Clara, you have to be strong," her mother Margaret often said. But Clara felt her strength waver more with each passing day since her mother's death. The grief was still fresh, and the arrival of Camille only complicated everything. "I don't know why Dad remarried so quickly," Clara confided to her best friend Alice during an afternoon tea. Alice, a petite woman with naturally curly brown hair, frowned. "Clara, do you think Camille has ulterior motives? A young and alluring woman like her rarely falls in love so simply." "Do you think I don't know that?" Clara cut her off, her eyes flashing with suspicion. "I've looked into it, but I haven't found any evidence. She's like a spotless mirror, always doing everything perfectly." Camille, 35 years old, had entered the Morgan family with impeccable credentials, intelligent, charming, and always knowing the right thing to say. To George Morgan, a lonely older man grieving the loss of his wife, Camille was a breath of fresh air. But to Clara, she was a threatening shadow. That afternoon, Camille appeared in an elegant cream-colored dress, her hair neatly styled into a high bun. Her confident smile radiated as she entered the room. "Clara, I hope you don't mind, but I've reorganized a few things in the library. I thought some of those old books needed better categorization. The library is my private space," Clara said sharply, unable to conceal her irritation. Camille chuckled lightly, her tone sweet but with an underlying edge. "Clara, this is our home. We need to manage everything together. I'm only trying to help." Alice sat silently, her eyes observing the confrontation. Clara felt her anger rising, but she didn't want to lose her composure in front of this woman. That evening, Clara sat alone in the library, her fingers tracing her mother's journal. She reread the familiar words, feeling her mother's presence in every page. But she couldn't concentrate. Camille's image kept haunting her mind. The library door unexpectedly opened, and Lucy, the family's longtime housekeeper, stepped in. Lucy, around 50 years old, had cared for Clara since she was a child. "I brought you some tea," she said, her voice as gentle as ever. "Gracias, Lucy," Clara replied, trying to smile. Lucy lingered for a moment, as if wanting to say something but hesitating. Finally, she gave a slight bow and left. Clara watched her go, sensing the woman's worry. Could it be that Lucy also suspected Camille? But she said nothing. The next morning, during breakfast, Camille took the initiative to start a conversation. "Clara, I think we should host a memorial dinner to honor your mother. I want everyone to remember her with good thoughts." Clara set her knife and fork down on the table, her gaze icy as she looked at Camille. "You don't need to pretend to care. My mother doesn't need false words." "Clara." George interrupted, his tone stern. "Camille is just trying to do something good for the family. You shouldn't be so rude." Clara felt like a dagger had pierced her heart. "Excuse me," she said, standing up and leaving the table, leaving an uncomfortable silence behind. That night, Clara sat in the library, trying to focus on her work. Suddenly, she felt unwell. A wave of dizziness hit her. She grabbed onto the desk, trying to steady herself. Her vision blurred, and she collapsed onto the floor, unable to call out for help. The next morning, Lucy found Clara unconscious in the library. Her scream brought everyone running. Camille was the first to rush in. "Clara! Oh my God, Clara!" she screamed, her face filled with panic. George hurriedly called the family doctor. But by the time the doctor arrived, Clara was no longer conscious. "Does Clara have a history of high blood pressure?" the doctor asked. Camille quickly responded. "Yes, she's fainted a few times before. I think we should let her rest in peace." I'll take care of everything. Alice arrived at the house in the afternoon, shocked into silence by the news of Clara's death. Lucy, who was always reserved, pulled Alice aside. I don't believe Clara died from an illness. She was perfectly healthy, she whispered. Lucy, what are you saying? Alice asked, her eyes serious. I have no proof. But Camille, I have a very bad feeling about her, Lucy replied, her voice breaking. Alice clenched her fists. I won't let this go. Clara can't just leave like this. That afternoon, the Morgan mansion became unusually somber. The thick walls seemed incapable of hiding the heavy air of suspicion that lingered. All the staff in the house, from the gardener to the housekeeper, were hesitant, afraid to say the wrong thing. Clara's sudden passing left a huge void in everyone's hearts, but for Alice and Lucy, it was more than a loss, it was a question of justice. This doesn't feel right, Alice, Lucy whispered as the two stood in the kitchen. Lucy kept wringing the cloth in her hands, her eyes darting around anxiously. Clara was never hypertensive. She was always healthy, full of energy. How could this happen? Alice nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. I don't believe this was just an accident. She told me she felt Camille wasn't right, but I didn't think it could be this serious. We need to get to the bottom of this. Lucy glanced down the hall, where Camille was chatting cheerfully with George and a well-dressed stranger in a black suit. Look at her, Alice. Just 2 days after Clara's death, and she's already laughing and talking like nothing happened. Alice tightened her grip on the counter. I'll talk to Camille. Let's see how she reacts. In the living room, Camille was meeting with an important guest, the Morgan family lawyer, Mr. Philip Goodman. The middle-aged man, tall with round glasses, listened to Camille's presentation with a professional demeanor. Clara always wanted the Morgan family to maintain her charity foundation, Camille said, a slight smile appearing on her face. I will make sure her wishes are carried out properly. Philip nodded slightly. That's commendable, Senora Camille. However, we need to verify some legal documents. I'll also need to discuss this with Mr. George. Of course, everything must be clear, Camille replied, her eyes briefly flashing with calculation. At that moment, Alice entered, her voice firm. Camille, I need to speak with you privately. Camille turned to Alice, maintaining her calm demeanor. We can talk later, Alice. I'm busy with Mr. Philip. No, this is very important, Alice insisted. Reluctantly, Camille stood up, signaling Philip to wait. She followed Alice to a secluded corner of the hallway. What is it, Alice? Can't you see I'm busy? Camille asked, her tone soft but tinged with irritation. Alice faced Camille, her gaze sharp. Don't you find Clara's death suspicious? Camille tilted her head slightly, a faint smile on her lips. Alice, I understand you're grieving the loss of your friend, but not everything has a conspiracy behind it. Clara had health issues, and her death was just a tragic accident. You're lying. Alice blurted, her voice trembling with anger. I know Clara. She wasn't sick. And you're too calm about everything. This is not normal. Camille sighed as if she were losing patience. Alice, you're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. If you continue to accuse me without evidence, I won't take it lightly. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Alice standing there, furious and helpless. That night, Lucy decided to take action. She sneaked into the library where Clara had died, searching for any clues that might shed light on the incident. She inspected every corner, every drawer, and suddenly found a small box of medication hidden in the desk. The box was labeled with the name of a strong sedative. Lucy's hands trembled as she held the box, her eyes filled with suspicion. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps outside the door startled her. She quickly stuffed the box into her pocket and stood up, trying to appear calm. The library door opened, and Camille appeared, her gaze suspicious as she looked at Lucy. "Lucy, what are you doing here at this hour?" Camille asked, her voice soft but laced with pressure. I was just tidying up a bit, Señora," Lucy replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Camille stepped closer, her sharp eyes fixed on Lucy. "You don't need to work so late. Go get some rest. I'll handle this myself." Lucy bowed her head and slipped past Camille to leave the room. But she knew that from now on, her every move would be closely watched. Meanwhile, Alice decided to visit Philip Goodman to gather more information. In Philip's office, she sat across from him, her expression serious. "Philip, I need to know about Clara's will. Has Camille been added as a beneficiary?" Philip adjusted his glasses, looking at Alice with a troubled expression. "Alice, this matter is confidential. But I can tell you that Clara transferred control of her charity foundation to Camille before she passed. Perhaps she trusted her." Alice felt a surge of anger. Trusted her? Clara never trusted Camille. "Philip, don't you find this strange?" Philip hesitated, as if torn between his professional duty and his conscience. "Alice, I feel something isn't right, too. But I need evidence, not just feelings." Alice nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "I will uncover the truth. Clara deserves to be vindicated." Back at the mansion, Camille sat in the living room, the soft lighting casting a glow on her face. A young man entered, carrying a stack of documents. "Señora Camille, here are the transfer papers you requested," he said. "Thank you, Xavier," Camille replied, her smile full of satisfaction. "Everything is going according to plan. No one can stop me." Xavier looked at Camille, his eyes showing a hint of concern. "Señora, are you sure no one is suspicious? I heard Alice is investigating." Camille smiled, her gaze icy. "She might suspect, but without evidence, she can do nothing. As long as we're careful, everything will remain under control." The next morning, the Morgan mansion was enveloped in a cold, tense atmosphere. Lucy couldn't shake her unease after finding the sedative box in Clara's library. She didn't dare share her discovery with Alice right away, fearing Camille would find out, but it was clear that the box was part of the dark truth she had suspected. In the dining room, Camille sat at the table with George, her expression relaxed as though Clara's death hadn't affected her. In front of them were local newspapers reporting Clara Morgan's sudden death, praising her as a compassionate and dedicated philanthropist. "See, George," Camille said gently, flipping through the pages. "Clara will always be remembered as a hero. We did the right thing by keeping everything peaceful, avoiding complicated investigations or autopsies." George, seated across the table, sighed softly. "I just want everything to be peaceful. Clara was my daughter, but I think you're right. These matters will only drag the family into unnecessary trouble." Camille smiled and took a sip of her tea. "Exactly. Clara wouldn't want her family to be hurt by unnecessary complications." Lucy stood quietly in a corner, her gaze filled with frustration as she listened to those words. George was entirely under Camille's manipulation. She couldn't understand how a father could so easily overlook the suspicious circumstances of his daughter's death. At Alice's house, she was hurriedly gathering every piece of information she could find about Camille. Spread out on her desk were numerous documents and old newspaper clippings related to Camille's past. Lucy was right, Alice muttered as she flipped through the files. Camille is not a simple person. Suddenly, her phone rang. It was Lucy. "Hello, Lucy. What's going on?" Alice asked urgently. "Señorita Alice, I need to meet you immediately. I have something. An important piece of evidence," Lucy whispered, clearly fearful. "What did you find?" Alice asked, her heart pounding. "I can't say over the phone. Meet me at Las Rosas Café this afternoon. I don't want to stay in the house any longer, Lucy replied quickly before hanging up. Alice set her phone down, her mind swirling with suspicion and hope. She knew Lucy was holding a crucial piece of the puzzle. That afternoon, Alice arrived at Las Rosas Café, where Lucy was waiting in a secluded corner. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and carried a large handbag, looking as if she were trying to avoid being noticed. "Lucy, what did you find?" Alice asked as soon as she sat down. Lucy looked around to make sure no one was listening, then pulled a small box of sleeping pills out of her bag. "I found this in Clara's library. It's not something Clara ever used. I'm certain of that." Alice took the box and read the label carefully. "This medication is very strong. If misused, it could be dangerous, even deadly." She looked up at Lucy, her eyes filled with determination. "Camille is definitely involved in this. But we need more to accuse her." Lucy nodded slightly. "I'll help you. I can't stand by and watch Clara be wronged without doing anything." At the mansion, Camille was sitting in her private room, reviewing documents related to Clara's charity foundation. The door suddenly opened, and Xavier entered, his face serious. "Señora Camille, I have bad news," he said, placing a stack of papers on the table. "Alice is investigating you. I heard she spoke with Philip Goodman and even met with Lucy outside." Camille straightened up, her eyes narrowing. "Alice, she doesn't know fear, does she?" Her voice carried a menacing tone. "I warned Lucy not to overstep. Perhaps she needs a reminder." Xavier hesitated. "Señora, I think we need to be careful. If this gets exposed, it won't just be you, it will involve me as well." Camille smirked. "Don't worry, Xavier. Everything is still under control. I'll take care of Lucy and Alice." That night, Lucy returned to the mansion, her heart heavy after meeting with Alice. She knew she was taking a risk, but the truth about Clara's death wouldn't let her stay silent. As she entered her room, she noticed a letter on the desk. She opened it and read the brief message. "Don't interfere in things that don't concern you, unless you want to face the consequences." Lucy's face turned pale, her hands trembling as she dropped the letter onto the floor. She looked around, feeling as if someone was watching her. Fear gripped her, but she refused to let it take over. She knew she couldn't back down now. Meanwhile, Alice was at home, going over the notes and evidence she had gathered. The doorbell rang, startling her. When she opened the door, she found a large envelope on the doorstep, but no one was around. Alice picked up the envelope, opened it, and found a photograph of herself and Lucy at Las Rosas Café. Along with it was a scrawled note. "It's better for you to stop before things go too far." Alice's heart raced. Someone was watching them. Camille was sending a warning. But instead of fear, this only strengthened her resolve. Clara deserved justice, and Alice wouldn't stop until the truth came to light. The following morning, Lucy woke up with a sense of unease. She had spent the entire night tossing and turning because of the threatening letter left on her desk. The pale morning light streaming through the window illuminated the letter on the floor. She picked it up again, rereading every word as if trying to find a clue about who had sent it. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Lucy jumped, her unease growing stronger. She walked slowly to the door and opened it to find Camille standing there, her face still wearing its usual false friendliness. "Lucy, I need your help with something," Camille said, her voice sweet but carrying an undertone of pressure. "Would you mind tidying up the library a bit? I think it could use some organizing." Lucy swallowed hard, trying to keep calm. "Yes, Señora Camille. I'll do it right away." Camille smiled faintly. "Good. Oh, and Lucy," she looked deeply into Lucy's eyes, her voice lowering. "You know, sometimes being too curious isn't a good thing." Camille's words felt like a dagger to Lucy's heart. She bowed her head, not daring to respond, and brushed past Camille to head toward the library. But deep inside, Lucy knew, Camille was watching her every move. At Las Rosas Café, Alice sat across from Philip Goodman. She had asked him to come so they could discuss what she had uncovered. "Philip, I need your help to investigate Camille further," Alice said, placing the box of sleeping pills Lucy had found on the table in front of him. "This is important evidence. If we can trace its origin, we might prove Camille's involvement in Clara's death." Philip frowned as he picked up the box, examining it carefully. "This type of medication is only available with a doctor's prescription. If we can find out who purchased it, we might get a lead. But Alice, this won't be easy. Camille has significant influence within the Morgan family, and she'll certainly try to obstruct us." "I don't care," Alice replied, her eyes filled with determination. "Clara was my friend. I can't let her be buried without justice." Philip nodded. "All right. I'll help you. But we need to be careful. If Camille finds out, she won't hesitate to do whatever it takes to protect herself." At the Morgan mansion, Camille sat in her office, her expression thoughtful. Xavier, her loyal assistant, stood before her. "Xavier, I don't like Alice and Lucy interfering," Camille said coldly. "We need to do something to extinguish any doubts before this gets out of hand." Xavier hesitated. "Senora, I understand your concern, but if we act too blatantly, it could backfire. I think it's better to make them stop on their own." Camille chuckled softly, her eyes glinting with calculation. "I've warned them, but it seems they didn't understand the warning. Then we'll have to take stronger measures." She leaned back in her chair, her hands gripping the armrests tightly. "I want Lucy out of this house. She's been here too long and is overstepping her bounds. Find a reason to fire her." Xavier nodded. "I'll take care of it." That afternoon, Lucy received a notice of dismissal. She stood frozen outside Camille's office, clutching the piece of paper tightly in her hands. "Why? What did I do wrong?" Lucy asked, her voice trembling. Camille sat behind her desk, her expression icy. "Lucy, you've served the Morgan family for many years, and we are very grateful for that. But your time here has come to an end. We need someone new, someone more dynamic." Lucy stared at Camille, her eyes filling with tears. "You're firing me because I know too much, aren't you?" Camille raised an eyebrow and smiled faintly. "Lucy, what are you talking about? I don't understand what you mean." Lucy gripped the paper tightly, knowing she couldn't fight Camille directly at that moment. "I won't let this go, Senora. Clara deserves justice." Camille watched Lucy leave, her smile fading. "Go ahead and try," she murmured, her gaze cold and sharp. That evening, Alice received a phone call from Lucy. "Alice, Camille fired me," Lucy said, her voice filled with anger. "She knows I'm investigating and wants to get rid of me." Alice tightened her grip on the phone. "Lucy, you can't let her silence you. Do you have somewhere to stay? I'll come get you." "No need, I'll be fine." "But Alice, we need to act quickly. I found something else important in the library before I was fired. I'll bring it to you tomorrow morning." "All right. Be careful, Lucy," Alice replied, sensing the looming danger. Late that night, at the Morgan mansion, Xavier quietly entered the library. He carried a small bag containing a box of matches and a bottle of flammable liquid. His task was clear: erase any traces Lucy might have left behind. "Make sure nothing is left behind," Camille had ordered, and Xavier dared not disobey. He spread the liquid throughout the room, his eyes scanning every corner to ensure nothing was overlooked. As the pungent smell of chemicals filled the air, Xavier lit a match. The flames quickly engulfed the room, devouring the entire library in minutes. Outside, Camille stood on the balcony, watching the blazing fire with an expressionless face. Clara, now everything that remains of you has been completely erased, she whispered. The next morning, Alice woke with a sense of unease. She received a text from Lucy. I'll bring the evidence to you this morning. Meet me at Las Rosas Cafe. But when the appointed time arrived, Lucy still hadn't shown up. Alice checked her phone repeatedly, but there were no new calls or messages. What happened? Alice whispered, her worry growing. She tried calling Lucy, but the line was busy. Alice's mind swirled with dark theories. The Morgan mansion, with its sinister secrets, seemed to have swallowed Lucy whole. At the Morgan mansion, Camille sat on the sofa, sipping her morning coffee. Xavier, who had completed the task of burning the library the night before, stood before her. Everything went smoothly? Camille asked, her tone calm but authoritative. Completely, Senora, Xavier replied, bowing his head. There's nothing left in the library that could be used as evidence. Camille smiled with satisfaction, but her eyes glimmered with caution. Good. But I want to ensure that Lucy won't interfere any further. She's become a significant risk. Do you want me to deal with her? Xavier asked, his voice low as though he were whispering to himself. Camille thought for a moment, then shook her head. Not necessary. Threats can sometimes be more effective than direct action. Make sure she knows that if she continues, things will get worse for her. Xavier nodded and left the room, leaving Camille deep in thought. Even though she had destroyed the library, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still beyond her control. Alice couldn't sit idly by. After failing to contact Lucy, she decided to drive to her house to check on her. Lucy's small house, located on the outskirts of the city and surrounded by dense trees, greeted Alice with a shocking scene. The door was wide open, and the interior was in complete disarray, as if someone had ransacked the place. Alice stepped inside, calling out loudly. Lucy! Are you here? There was no response. Alice searched the house but found no sign of Lucy. On the kitchen table, she found a crumpled piece of paper with scribbled writing. I'm being watched. If anything happens, check the old wardrobe in the bedroom. Alice rushed to the bedroom and opened the old wardrobe mentioned in the note. Inside, she found a small wooden box locked tightly. She took the box with her, her heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and fear. Back at her house, Alice worked on opening the box. After several attempts, she managed to break the lock with a small hammer. Inside, she found a small diary and a few clipped papers. She opened the diary and realized it belonged to Clara. The initial pages were filled with stories about Clara's charity projects, but the later entries were disjointed and filled with alarming notes. I feel like Camille is hiding something. She's too perfect, but I don't trust her. Last night, I saw her sneaking out of the library when I walked in. Today, I found a strange box of medicine in Camille's room. I need to investigate further. Mom, I wish you were still here to help me. Alice felt her chest tighten as she read the words. Clara had been suspicious of Camille for a long time but hadn't lived to uncover the truth. She continued examining the clipped papers and discovered they were receipts for medication from a local pharmacy. This receipt might be the key, Alice murmured. If I can find out who purchased this medicine, the truth will come to light. Meanwhile, at the Morgan mansion, Camille began to realize that Alice and Lucy were pushing her into a defensive position. Although she had temporarily regained control, she sensed danger approaching. She called Xavier into her office, her voice cold. Xavier, I need you to monitor Alice. She's not going to stop. I want to know her every move from now until she gives up. Xavier bowed. I'll take care of it, Senora. But do you think she found anything from Lucy? Camille frowned, her gaze sharp. I'm not sure. But if she has any evidence, we'll have to act before she can use it. That evening, Alice decided to visit the pharmacy listed on the receipt. She met with the manager, an older man named Rodrigo. When Alice presented the receipt, Rodrigo looked at her curiously. "Señorita, this receipt is from a few weeks ago." "I don't remember clearly, but let me check the system," Rodrigo said, beginning his search. After a few minutes, he looked up, his expression changed. This medication was purchased by someone named Camille Morgan. Alice felt as if someone had squeezed her heart. "Are you sure?" Rodrigo nodded. "Absolutely." The name and address matched the details on the receipt. Alice took the receipt, feeling a mix of fear and anger. This was the proof she needed to tie Camille to Clara's death. Driving home that night, Alice clutched the receipt on the seat beside her. Her mind raced with thoughts. Camille bought that medication. This is irrefutable evidence. But I need to be careful. She's dangerous. When she arrived home, Alice locked her doors securely and placed the receipt in a safe drawer. She knew this wasn't just critical evidence but also something that could make her Camille's next target. Sitting down, Alice glanced at Clara's diary on the table. "Clara, I will uncover the truth. I promise you." At the Morgan mansion, Camille was on the phone with Xavier. Her voice was low but filled with menace. "Xavier, Alice has something in her possession. I'm sure of it. You need to find a way to retrieve it, at any cost." Xavier hesitated. "Señora, she's very cautious. If we act too aggressively, it might draw attention." Camille gripped the phone tightly, her voice brimming with anger. "If you don't act, we'll lose everything. Do whatever it takes, but make sure you leave no traces." Xavier nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Understood, Señora. I'll handle it." The following morning, Alice went to meet Philip at his office. She placed Clara's diary and the pharmacy receipt on his desk, her voice grave. "This is the evidence I found. Camille is the one who bought the medication that could have led to Clara's death." Philip flipped through the diary and examined the receipt. He frowned, clearly recognizing the gravity of the situation. "Alice, what you have is very important. But we'll need additional support from the police to bring this to light." "Then we report this to the police immediately," Alice said decisively. "I can't let her get away with this." Philip nodded. "I'll work with a trusted friend in the force. But you need to be careful, Alice. Camille is not an easy person to deal with." That evening, Alice received an unexpected phone call. When she answered, Xavier's voice came through on the other end. "Señorita Alice, I think we need to meet." Alice was surprised. "Xavier? Why are you calling me? You work for Camille." "Señorita, I can't say much over the phone. I have something important to reveal. Meet me at Las Rosas Café at 10 p.m. Don't let anyone know." Alice hesitated. Xavier was not someone she trusted, but if he truly had critical information, she couldn't pass up the opportunity. "All right, I'll be there," she replied, her voice filled with suspicion. At Las Rosas Café, Alice arrived on time. The atmosphere was unusually quiet. Xavier was already seated in a secluded corner, his eyes darting nervously around. When Alice sat down, he immediately began speaking in a whisper. "Señorita, I've worked for Camille for years. But I can't continue. She's crossed every line. I don't want to be involved in her crimes anymore." "You're talking about Clara's death, aren't you?" Alice asked, her voice cold. Xavier nodded. "Yes. Camille used that medication to render Clara unconscious. Then she staged everything to make it look like a natural death. But I never thought she would take things this far." "Do you have any proof?" Alice asked, struggling to contain her anger. Xavier pulled a USB drive from his pocket and placed it on the table. "This contains financial records tied to Camille. They show that she diverted funds from Clara's charity into her own accounts. I think this will help you prove her motive. Alice picked up the USB drive, her eyes lighting up with hope. Xavier, why are you helping me? Aren't you afraid of Camille? I am, Xavier admitted, his voice trembling. But I'm more afraid of my conscience. Clara was a good person. She didn't deserve to die like that. As Alice left the cafe, she realized she was being followed. A black car tailed her the entire way home. Alice sped up, trying to lose the car, but it wouldn't back off. When she finally reached her house, she locked the doors and checked the USB drive. Inside, the financial records were meticulously organized, clearly proving that Camille had embezzled funds from Clara's charity to enrich herself. Alice exhaled deeply, knowing she now had the strongest evidence yet to expose Camille. Meanwhile, at the Morgan mansion, Camille received word from one of her associates. Senora, Xavier has betrayed us. He met with Alice and gave her something. Camille stood up abruptly, her eyes blazing with fury. That traitor. I trusted him. Fine, if Xavier wants to be a traitor, I won't hold back. Do you want us to take care of him? The associate asked. Camille smirked coldly. Not yet. Let him think he's safe. But as for Alice, we need to act immediately. Late at night, in her home office, Alice was reviewing everything one last time. When she glanced out the window, she saw the silhouette of a man approaching. Alice quickly turned off the lights and held her breath. Loud, persistent knocks echoed through the door. Alice, open up, an unfamiliar voice shouted. Alice stepped back, clutching her phone to call the police. But before she could act, the window shattered, and a hand pulled her down to the floor. Everything went black. A few days later, the dim light in a hospital room seeped through the blinds. Alice slowly opened her eyes, wincing at the sharp pain in her head. She tried to sit up, but a familiar voice spoke from beside her. You're awake. Thank God. Alice turned her head to see Philip sitting by her bed, his eyes filled with concern. Philip, where am I? You're in the hospital. Your neighbors found out about the attack and called the police. You were struck on the head, but thankfully there's no serious injury, Philip explained, his voice steady but concerned. Lucy, where's Lucy? I need to see her. Alice immediately asked, but Philip shook his head. We haven't found her. The police searched her house, but she's not there. All they found was an empty house with signs that she left in a hurry, Philip said, his expression troubled. Alice clenched her fists. I don't believe she left willingly. This is Camille. She's trying to silence everyone who could threaten her. At the same time, at the Morgan mansion, Camille was meeting with Police Chief Nathaniel Robert, a middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed mustache and piercing eyes. Camille maintained a calm demeanor, but inside, she was anxious. Senora Camille, we need to ask you some questions about the attack on Alice, Nathaniel said, carefully observing every expression on her face. Chief, I'm terribly sorry to hear about this incident, but I don't understand why you think I'm involved. I was here, at home, the entire evening, Camille replied, her voice smooth but firm. Nathaniel nodded. Yes, we've verified that you were at the mansion at the time. However, I must be straightforward, suspicions surrounding Clara Morgan's death are increasing. We've received new information from an anonymous source. Camille maintained her smile, but her hands under the table were clenched so tightly they were trembling. I've always been willing to cooperate with the police. Clara was my husband's stepdaughter, and I cared for her as if she were my own family. Nathaniel tilted his head slightly. Good. We'll be in touch again. He stood and left the room, casting her a meaningful glance before departing. At the hospital, Alice recounted the entire story to Nathaniel during his visit. Philip sat beside her, frequently adding details Alice might have missed due to the shock. I found Clara's diary and the receipt for the medication in Lucy's wardrobe. Everything points to Camille orchestrating Clara's murder to seize her assets and charity foundation, Alice said, her eyes shining with determination. Nathaniel took careful notes. And the USB that Xavier gave you, where is it now? Alice took a deep breath. It's still in the safe drawer at my house. But I don't trust anywhere to be safe anymore. Nathaniel nodded slightly. We'll arrange protection for you. I'll also send someone to retrieve the USB immediately. That afternoon, Xavier unexpectedly appeared at the hospital. He walked into Alice's room with a weary but serious expression. Philip immediately stood up, his gaze filled with suspicion. What are you doing here? Philip asked, his tone brimming with distrust. I'm here to help, Xavier replied, raising his hands as if to show he meant no harm. I know I've made mistakes, but I can't let Camille get away with this. I have more important information. Alice studied Xavier carefully. What information? Xavier lowered his voice. Camille hasn't just embezzled funds from the charity. She has a much larger plan to sell off the entire Morgan estate and transfer all the money overseas. She's already prepared fake passports and intends to disappear before anyone can catch her. Philip frowned. Do you have proof? I do, Xavier said, pulling a folder from his jacket. These are copies of her recent transactions. We need to act now before she executes her plan. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Camille was meeting with a man named Stephen, an expert in forged documents. Stephen, I need everything ready within 48 hours. No mistakes, Camille said, her voice sharp. Stephen chuckled softly, his expression confident. Don't worry, Senora. Everything will be perfect. Once you leave, no one will be able to trace you. Camille nodded, her eyes calculating. Good. This is my only chance. That evening, Alice, Nathaniel, and Xavier met at police headquarters to finalize their plan. Xavier pointed to the documents he had brought. Camille has moved most of the money into an overseas account. If we can block the final transaction, she won't be able to escape, Xavier explained. Nathaniel nodded. I'll contact the bank and issue a freeze on the account. But we need more solid evidence to arrest her before she flees. I have the USB in Clara's diary. They're enough to prove her crimes, Alice said. Nathaniel looked at them both. Good. Then we'll act tomorrow. Camille won't escape. The next morning at police headquarters, Nathaniel convened a special investigation team. He carefully reviewed the materials provided by Xavier and Alice, the medication receipt, Clara's diary, and the USB filled with incriminating financial transactions. This is everything we need to launch the case. I've requested the freeze on Camille's bank account, but we must act quickly before she realizes her plan has been disrupted, Nathaniel said firmly. Alice sat nearby, still sore from her injuries. Despite this, her eyes burned with resolve. I'll do whatever it takes to help crack this case. Clara cannot die unjustly. Xavier, standing opposite her, nodded in agreement. I'll cooperate fully. I've been too deeply involved in Camille's schemes, but now I'll make things right. Nathaniel looked at them both, his expression contemplative. Good. Xavier, you'll lead us to the location where Camille keeps her critical documents. Alice, you need to rest and recover, but if you're determined to join us, be prepared, this won't be easy. Meanwhile, at the Morgan mansion, Camille remained unaware that her bank account had been frozen. She was busy preparing for her escape. On her desk lay fake passports, plane tickets, and a suitcase full of cash. Stephen, is everything ready? Camille asked as the man standing opposite her nodded. Yes, Senora. But I've heard the police are digging deeper into the attack on Alice. Are you sure you'll leave safely? Stephen asked, a hint of worry in his eyes. Camille smirked, her gaze cold and piercing. I won't let anyone stand in my way. If the police make a move, I'll deal with them before they can act. At police headquarters, Nathaniel received confirmation from the bank. Camille's account had been successfully frozen. However, this also meant she would soon realize her plan had been blocked. We don't have much time. Xavier, take us to the location where she hides her documents. If Camille finds out, she might destroy everything before we arrive, Nathaniel said. Xavier took a deep breath and nodded. All right. I'll take you to a small house on the outskirts of town. It's where she keeps things she doesn't want anyone to know about. Alice, despite not being fully recovered, insisted on accompanying the team. In the car, she sat beside Nathaniel, clutching Clara's diary tightly. Chief, I can't stand by and do nothing. Clara was my best friend. I'll never forgive myself if I don't help bring the truth to light, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Nathaniel looked at Alice and gave a slight nod. I understand. But you must promise to stay safe. We can't afford any more casualties. Agreed, Alice replied, her gaze resolute. The team arrived at the small house on the outskirts of town that Xavier had directed them to. It was a modest building, hidden among dense trees. Nathaniel signaled to the police officers to surround the area, ensuring no one could enter or leave unnoticed. Xavier led the way, slowly opening the door. Inside, the air was damp and musty. He pointed to a large wooden cabinet in the corner of the room. The documents she's hiding are in there. Nathaniel and another officer carefully opened the cabinet. Inside, they found numerous envelopes containing financial records, illegal contracts, and documents related to Clara's charity foundation. We've got everything we need, Nathaniel said, his eyes gleaming. Camille won't escape this time. At that moment, the sound of a car engine echoed from a distance. A black vehicle sped toward the house and screeched to a halt in front. The car door opened, and Camille stepped out, her face furious as she saw the police searching through the house. What are you doing here? Camille shouted, her voice exuding authority. Nathaniel stepped out to confront her, unfazed. Senora Camille, we have concrete evidence of your embezzlement from Clara Morgan's charity and your involvement in her death. You are under arrest. Camille let out a dry laugh, her gaze landing on Xavier. I can't believe you betrayed me, Xavier. Do you think siding with them will make you safe? Xavier lowered his head, his voice raspy. I couldn't keep working for you after learning you killed Clara. Camille took a step forward, her eyes sharp as blades. You don't realize the grave mistake you've just made. Nathaniel signaled the officers to move closer, but suddenly, Camille pulled a small gun from her pocket and pointed it at Xavier. The tension in the air became unbearable. No one moves. If you want to arrest me, I'll take this traitor with me. Camille screamed, her hand shaking as she held the gun. Alice, standing beside Nathaniel, felt her heart race. Chief, we can't let her shoot Xavier. Stay calm, Alice. I'll handle this, Nathaniel said softly, his voice reassuring. He raised his hands and took slow steps toward Camille, showing he was unarmed. Senora, put the gun down. It's over. No. It's over when I say it's over. Camille shouted, her eyes wild with desperation. I worked so hard to get here. No one can take this away from me. In a sudden, unexpected move, Xavier lunged at Camille, grabbing her arm. A gunshot rang out, but no one was injured. The gun fell to the ground, and the officers quickly subdued her. Camille struggled and screamed. You can't arrest me. I am the head of the Morgan family. Everything I did was for my own rights. Nathaniel watched as Camille was handcuffed, exhaling in relief. Now, you'll pay for what you've done. At police headquarters, tension filled the air as Nathaniel escorted Camille into a temporary holding cell. She, with a hardened expression but worry flickering in her eyes, no longer carried her usual commanding presence. Meanwhile, Alice and Xavier sat in a conference room, both still shaken by the events. "We did it," Alice whispered, though her voice trembled. "Clara can finally rest in peace." Xavier nodded, his head bowed, regret still etched into his face. "I just hope what I've done can make up for my part in all this." Just then, the conference room door opened. Nathaniel entered, followed by a woman neither Alice nor Xavier expected to see, Lucy. She walked in with a weary but determined smile. "Lucy." Alice sprang up and embraced her. "Are you all right? I was so worried about you." Lucy gently patted Alice's back, her voice soft but slightly hoarse. "I'm fine. After being threatened, I went into hiding at a friend's house in the countryside. But when I heard Camille was arrested, I knew it was time to return and testify." Nathaniel stepped forward, placing a hand on Lucy's shoulder. "Your return is crucial. You're the most important witness to help us convict Camille in court." Lucy nodded. "I'll share everything I know. Clara deserves justice." The next day, at the city courthouse, the trial of Camille Morgan became the center of public attention. In the courtroom, Alice sat beside Lucy and Xavier, while George Morgan occupied a seat in the front row, his face a mix of disappointment and grief. When Camille was led in, her gaze swept over the crowd, unhidden disdain in her eyes. But when her eyes landed on George, she flinched slightly. He stood and walked directly toward her. In a moment of uncontainable anger, George raised his hand and slapped Camille hard, the sound echoing through the courtroom. "Camille!" George roared, his eyes bloodshot with rage. "I trusted you, loved you, and you repaid me with betrayal and cruelty toward my daughter. You didn't just kill Clara, you destroyed the honor of this family." The police quickly intervened, but George stood firm, his hands trembling. Camille stared at him silently, her composure finally cracking. She knew it was over. In the trial, the evidence was presented piece by piece. Alice provided Clara's diary, the medication receipt, and the financial documents from Xavier's USB. Lucy testified about Camille's suspicious behavior, from controlling the library to the threats she endured. Xavier, despite being Camille's former accomplice, confessed to every crime she had concealed, including the embezzlement of the charity funds and her escape plans. Ricardo Morales, the young prosecutor, concluded his arguments with conviction. Señora Camille Morgan not only committed murder but also betrayed the trust of a family. Her actions are unforgivable and demand the harshest punishment. When called to speak, Camille maintained her composure. "I didn't kill Clara. Everything I did was for the Morgan family. If they don't see that, it's their failure, not mine." But her weak defense couldn't hide the truth. George, seated silently among the spectators, bowed his head, unwilling to look any longer. The court delivered its verdict. Camille Morgan was sentenced to life in prison for murder and financial misconduct. The sentence was met with applause from the crowd. As Camille was escorted out, she turned to George, her eyes filled with a mix of hatred and regret. "George, I did everything for you. And yet, you chose to stand against me," she said, her voice hoarse. George didn't respond, simply turning away in silence. A week after the trial, at the church where Clara had held her charity events, George organized a memorial for his daughter. Alice, Lucy, Xavier, and Philip attended the event. George stepped up to the podium, his voice breaking with emotion as he spoke. "Clara, my daughter, was a remarkable woman. She dedicated her life to helping others, and I didn't do enough to protect her. But today, justice has been served for you. From now on, your charity will continue under the name Clara's Hope, to keep your spirit alive." The audience applauded, and Alice couldn't hold back her tears. She turned to Lucy and whispered, "Clara can finally rest in peace." Lucy nodded. "And we've won, not just for Clara, but for the truth." The ceremony ended with a sense of closure. George approached Alice and Lucy, taking their hands. "Thank you both. Without you, I would never have known the truth. I owe you more than I can say," he said, then walked away, his steps heavy with belated regrets. The story of Clara Morgan teaches us a profound lesson about justice and courage. Despite facing conspiracy, betrayal, and danger, those who loved Clara stood firm to uncover the truth. Justice cannot be hidden by deceit, and loyalty and perseverance will always triumph. This story underscores the value of solidarity, compassion, and the belief that goodness will always prevail, bringing hope and strength to the community.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.